Hi, this is going to be real brief. There's just a couple of things I wanted to say to you before we get moving on because the outline and your YouTube that you're seeing are really very informative. As I said on the slide, I suggest very much so that you have the PowerPoint available while you're reading your text to make it easier to understand. Yep, that was me a couple of years ago. I wanted to explain what does enlightenment really mean, and the dictionary definition is enlightenment means the state of being enlightened. So enlightenment in the 18th century was a philosophical movement stressing the importance of reason and the critical reappraisal of existing ideas and social institutions. Now, the history of science during the Age of Enlightenment traces developments in science and technology through what we call the Age of Reason. This is the time when the ideas were being spread all across Europe and even North America. And usually the time period we call it is from the final days of the 16th and 17th century scientific revolution until roughly the end of the 19th century, well, not the end, kind of the beginning, right after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. But the scientific revolution saw the creation of the first scientific societies, the displacement of the old Aristotelian natural philosophy, and Galen's ancient medical doctrine. So by the 18th century, scientific authority began to displace, there's the key word, displace religious authority, and the discipline of alchemy and astrology lost all scientific credibility. But you can't really pigeonhole enlightenment into a specific doctrine or set of dogmas. Science did come to play a leading role in the Enlightenment, and many Enlightenment writers and thinkers had backgrounds in the sciences and associated scientific advancement with the overthrow of religion, overthrow of religion and the traditional authority in favor of the development of free speech and thought. Broadly speaking, Enlightenment science greatly valued empiricism, which you saw in the text and also in the YouTube, form a hypothesis, observe, and then experiment. They believed in advancement and progress. And with most Enlightenment views, the benefits of science were not seen universally. Jean-Jacques Rousseau criticized the scientists for distancing man from nature and not operating to make people happier. But science during the Enlightenment was dominated by scientific societies and academies. And here you see a group of men standing around discussing the their navel. And these scientific societies and academies had actually replaced universities as centers of scientific research and development. Societies and academies were also the backbone of the maturation of the scientific profession. But one of the biggest and I think most important things that happened was the popularization of science among an increasing literate population. They introduced to the public many scientific theories, and most notably through what they call the encyclopedia and the popularization of Newtonianism by Voltaire. And then there was a translation of Newton's principles. Some historians have marked the 18th century as a drab period in the history of science. I happen to disagree. However, the century saw significant advances in the practice of medicine and mathematics and physics. There was a development in the area of biology. There was a new understanding of magnetism and electricity, the maturation of chemistry as a discipline, and we begin to see the establishment of the foundations of modern chemistry. But one of the most important developments that the Enlightenment era brought was, as I repeat, was the discipline they brought to the discipline of science was the popularization of it. It doesn't do any good to make advances if the people don't know anything about it. And you've got to write it in language so they can understand it. But the increasing literate population gained knowledge in both the arts and sciences through the expansion of print culture and the dissemination of scientific learning. And a lot of this was due to the population was growing. They were healthier because they'd have better weather and better crops and food was available. So some people got to rise out of poverty, and instead of paying more for food, they actually had money to pay for an education. But popularization was generally part of the overreaching Enlightenment idea that They tried to make information available to the greatest number of people. And as public interest in natural philosophy grew during the 18th century, public lecture courses and the publication of popular text, well, it opened up roads, well, naturally, to fame for amateurs and scientists who were kind of on the periphery of the universities, but now they could write and they could teach. One more thing before I let you go. During this Enlightenment era, quote unquote, women were excluded from scientific societies and universities and any learned profession. The ladies were educated, if at all, through self-study, tutors, and a teaching of more open-minded fathers. And when I teach women's history, we discuss that most of the women who made it to the front pages, so to speak, all had fathers and had daughters with no sons. They educated their daughter as if he had been a son. But with the exception of daughters of craftsmen, who sometimes learned their father's profession by assisting, learned women were primarily a part of a very small elite society. And as a result of the exclusion of women from societies and universities, it prevented a lot of independent research because they didn't have the ability to access instruments that they needed for something as silly as a microscope. As a matter of fact, in the 18th century, restrictions were so severe for women, including midwives. The midwives were forbidden from using forceps. And of course, that particular restriction began to exemplify the increasing constricted male-dominated medical community. And over the course of the 18th century, male surgeons began to assume the role of midwives in gynecology. And some male satirists ridiculed any scientific-minded woman, describing them as neglectful of their domestic role. And the negative view of women in science is reflected in the sentiment apparent in some Enlightenment texts that women need not or ought to be educated. For instance, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in his Emily, quote, "A woman's education must be planned in relation to man, to be pleasing in his sight, to win his respect and love, to train him in childhood, to tend him in manhood, to counsel and console, and to make his life pleasant and happy. And these are the duties of women for all time. And this is what she ought to be taught when she is young." I'm not even going to say what I'm thinking. I'll just say I'll see you Monday. Don't forget to do all of your assignments. Thank you for listening.